My grandfather passed away last spring. At the reading of his will, the attorney handed my father a second sealed envelope. Not for the estate, for him personally. My father read it in the parking lot and did not speak for 3 days. Tonight every single story is about a family secret that stayed buried until simply could not anymore. 5 families, 5 truths that changed everything. This is the part that gets me every time. Let me take you back to where each of these stories started. My name is Catherine. I am 40 years old. I live in St. Louis, Missouri, and 9 months ago my grandfather passed away at 89 and his estate attorney, during the will reading, handed my father a second envelope, separate from the standard estate documentation, marked personal and confidential, addressed specifically to my father in my grandfather's handwriting. My father's name is Robert. He is 67 years old and had, as far as I understood growing up, a relationship with his own father that was warm but not especially close, the kind of relationship many adult sons have with their fathers, defined by holiday visits and occasional fishing trips rather than deep emotional intimacy, which I had always assumed was simply their generational way of relating to each other. My father took the envelope, said he needed some air, and left the attorney's conference room. He did not return for nearly 40 minutes. When he came back, his face had a quality I had never seen on him before, and he did not discuss the envelope's contents with anyone in the room, simply saying he would share what he needed to share when he was ready. I want to describe the 3 days that followed, because they were among the strangest of my adult life. My father barely spoke. He took time off work, which he almost never did. My mother told me, when I called to check on both of them, that my father had shown her the letter but had asked her not to share its contents with me or my siblings until he had processed it himself and decided how, or whether to tell us. On the 4th day, my father called a family meeting. Myself, my 2 siblings, and my mother gathered at my parents' house and told us what the letter contained. My grandfather, in the letter, had confessed something he had carried for over 60 years. Before marrying my grandmother, he had fathered a child with a woman he had a relationship with during a period before he met her, a woman he described in the letter as someone he had loved seriously but whose family had disapproved of the match for reasons rooted in class differences common to that era. The woman had become pregnant, and rather than marry her against her family's wishes, my grandfather had made the decision, under pressure from his own family as well, to end the relationship, providing some financial support but otherwise stepping back from any role in the child's life. He had married my grandmother 2 years later, built the family I had always known, and had, according to the letter, spent 60 years wondering about the child he had never known, a half-sibling to my father that my father had never known existed. The letter included the name of the child, now presumably an elderly person themselves if still living, and the last known location my grandfather had information about, decades-old information that might or might not still be accurate. My grandfather explained in the letter that he had decided not to seek out this information himself during his lifetime, out of respect for my grandmother and the family he had built with her, but that he could not die without at least giving my father the choice of what to do with the knowledge, rather than taking the secret to his grave entirely. I want to describe what this revelation did to our family's understanding of ourselves. My father, an only child as far as any of us had ever known, suddenly had to process the possibility of a half-sibling somewhere, someone who might be alive, who might have children and grandchildren of their own, an entirely unknown branch of our family that had existed, unacknowledged, for over 60 years. My father spent several weeks deciding whether to pursue this information at all, weighing his own curiosity and sense of obligation against the disruption it might cause to a stranger's life, someone who had presumably built their own understanding of their family without any knowledge of my grandfather's other family. Update 4 months later. My father ultimately decided to hire a genealogist to investigate, motivated primarily by a sense that he owed it to his father's memory, and perhaps to himself, to at least know whether this half-sibling was still living and what had become of them. The investigation took several months and revealed that my grandfather's first child, a daughter, had passed away 12 years ago, but had left behind 3 children of her own, cousins my father, and by extension my siblings and I, had never known existed. My father made contact with the eldest of these cousins, a woman named Patricia, 6 weeks ago, explaining the situation as gently as he could and expressing that he understood if she needed time to process this or did not wish to pursue any relationship at all. Patricia, it turned out, had grown up knowing something of her mother's origin story. Her mother had apparently spoken, occasionally and vaguely, about a father who had not been part of her life, though without the specific details my grandfather's letter provided. Patricia and my father have spoken twice by phone since that initial contact, careful exploratory conversations about family history and about what, if anything, they want their relationship to become going forward. I have not yet met Patricia or her siblings, though my father has mentioned the possibility of an eventual gathering once everyone has had time to process this new information. I think often about my grandfather's decision to write that letter rather than simply carry the secret to his grave, and about what it means that a 60-year-old choice, made under family pressure in circumstances very different from today, has rippled forward to create an entirely new set of relationships and questions for a family that thought it already knew its own shape. Catherine's grandfather carried his secret for 60 years before finally writing it down, and just like that letter, revealed a hidden branch of the family tree. The woman in story 2 discovered something that reshaped her family tree too, but she did not find it in a letter. She found it in a DNA test, one she had taken purely out of curiosity. Wait, this is the part that gets me most. Here is what she found. My name is Sarah. I am 33 years old, I live in Minneapolis, Minnesota, and 11 months ago I took a consumer DNA test as a birthday gift from a friend, purely out of curiosity about my ancestry, and received results that revealed the man who raised me, who I had called Dad my entire life, was not my biological father, a fact that my mother, I subsequently learned, had known since before I was born and had never disclosed to me or, as far as I could determine, to the man I knew as my father either. I want to describe the moment I received these results because the DNA testing service does not simply tell you this directly, it shows you predicted relationships based on shared genetic material, and the platform flagged my father, whose own DNA was in the same database because he had also taken a test years earlier out of his own curiosity, with a relationship category that did not match what a biological father-daughter relationship should show. I initially assumed a testing error, a not uncommon occurrence with consumer genetic testing, and contacted the company's support team, who reviewed the results and confirmed there was no error. The genetic data clearly indicated my father, the man who had raised me, changed my diapers, taught me to ride a bike, and walked me down the aisle at my wedding 4 years earlier, shared no more genetic material with me than an unrelated person would. I sat with this information for nearly 2 weeks before saying anything to anyone, trying to understand what it meant and how to even begin approaching a conversation about it. I eventually confronted my mother, showing her the test results and asking her, as directly as I could manage, whether she knew anything that might explain this. My mother's reaction, immediate, visible distress rather than confusion or denial, told me before she said anything that this was not news to her. She explained, through considerable emotion, that she had had a brief relationship with another man during a period when she and my father, who I will call Mark to distinguish him from my biological father, had been going through significant difficulty in their marriage, a period roughly 9 months before my birth. She had become pregnant during this period and had made the decision at the time that she was not certain which man was the biological father, but had chosen not to pursue testing or disclosure, deciding instead to remain in her marriage to Mark and to raise me within that marriage without ever revealing the uncertainty to him. She told me she had convinced herself over the years that the biological question did not matter, that Mark had raised me and loved me as his own regardless of genetics, and that revealing the truth would serve no purpose beyond causing pain to a family that was otherwise happy and stable. I want to describe what it felt like to learn that my entire understanding of my own origin had been built on a decision my mother made before I was even born. A decision to withhold information not just from me but from the man who believed for 33 years that he was my biological father. I confronted this next with an even more difficult question. Did Mark know? My mother told me, with what appeared to be genuine anguish, that Mark did not know, that she had never told him about the other relationship or the resulting uncertainty about my paternity, and that she had spent over 3 decades managing this secret entirely alone. Update 4 months later. I made the decision, after significant consultation with a therapist and considerable internal conflict, to tell Mark what I had learned, believing that regardless of my mother's reasoning, he deserved to know the truth about a fact this fundamental to his own life and identity as my father. This conversation, which I had alone with Mark without my mother present, was one of the most difficult of my life. Mark's initial reaction was disbelief, followed by a request that we pursue a paternity test together to confirm what the ancestry DNA results suggested, which we did, and which confirmed definitively that he was not my biological father. Mark has told me in the months since that this knowledge has not changed how he feels about me or our relationship. He raised me, he says, and that fact matters more to him than genetics, but that it has fundamentally altered his understanding of his marriage and his trust in my mother, given that she kept this uncertainty from him for over 3 decades rather than allowing him to make an informed decision about how to proceed with their relationship at the time. Mark and my mother separated 2 months ago, a development that has been painful for our entire family. Though Mark has been clear that the separation is not about my paternity itself, but about the decades of concealment that followed my mother's original decision. I have not pursued contact with my biological father, whose identity my mother provided once Mark knew the truth. I am still processing what, if anything, I want that relationship to look like while continuing to consider Mark my father in every way that matters beyond biology. A fact he has told me repeatedly he wants me to know remains unchanged regardless of what happens between him and my mother. Sarah's mother carried a secret for 33 years that a simple DNA test finally revealed, and just like Sarah's family, was reshaped by unexpected genetic results. The man in Story 3 discovered his family's secret through something even more unexpected. A newspaper article about a stranger who happened to share his mother's maiden name, and a death that occurred 60 years before he was even born. Let that sink in. Here is what he found. My name is Thomas. I am 45 years old. I live in Baltimore, Maryland, and 7 months ago I was researching my mother's side of the family for a genealogy project when I discovered a newspaper archive article from 63 years ago, reporting the death of a young woman with my mother's maiden name, listed as the daughter of my maternal grandparents, at the age of 19, meaning she would have been my mother's older sister, an aunt I had never once heard mentioned in 45 years of family gatherings, holidays, and conversations about family history. My mother's name is Elizabeth. She is 72 years old and has always presented her family history simply. An only child, raised by parents who had passed away before I was old enough to remember them clearly, with no siblings ever mentioned in any context throughout my entire life. The newspaper article I found described the young woman, Margaret, as having died from what the brief obituary described only as a sudden illness, survived by her parents and notably listed no siblings, which struck me as unusual if my mother had already been born at the time of this death, since a surviving sibling would typically be mentioned in an obituary of that era. I want to describe the process of trying to understand this discrepancy, because it took considerable investigation before I felt I had enough information to approach my mother directly. I ordered a copy of Margaret's death certificate, which confirmed the same parents I knew to be my mother's parents, and cross-referenced this against my mother's own birth certificate, which showed she had been born 4 years before Margaret's death, meaning Margaret would have been approximately 15 years older than my mother, an age gap that might explain why an infant or young child sibling had not been mentioned in a formal obituary written for an adult audience focused on Margaret's own peer relationships and community involvement. I confronted my mother with this information during a visit, showing her the newspaper article and the death certificate, and asking her directly why she had never mentioned having an older sister. My mother's reaction was immediate and profound distress, tears before words, and it took considerable time before she was able to explain what this discovery had uncovered. Margaret, my mother explained, had died not from a sudden illness as the sanitized obituary suggested, but by suicide, following what my mother, only 4 years old at the time and piecing together fragments over subsequent decades from overheard adult conversations she was never meant to hear, understood to be a combination of severe depression and family conflict related to a relationship Margaret had wanted to pursue that her parents, my grandparents, had strongly disapproved of. My mother explained that in the aftermath of this tragedy, our family had made a collective decision, common in that era for deaths by suicide, to simply never discuss Margaret again, to remove her from family conversation entirely as a way of managing grief, and my mother believed shame that her parents felt about how the community would perceive both the death itself and their own parenting. My mother had grown up in a household where her older sister's existence became, effectively, an unspoken family rule of silence, one so thoroughly enforced over the following decades that my mother had, by the time she had her own children, simply internalized the practice of not discussing Margaret at all, to the point that I had grown up with no knowledge she had ever existed. Update. For months later, my mother and I have spent considerable time in the months since this discovery discussing Margaret, conversations my mother has described as simultaneously painful and, ultimately, relieving, having carried the weight of this enforced silence for nearly 7 decades without ever having the opportunity to properly grieve or discuss her sister openly. We visited Margaret's grave together for the first time in my mother's living memory 2 months ago, a visit my mother described afterward as one of the most emotionally significant experiences of her life. I have begun researching Margaret's life more fully, finding old photographs and yearbook records that have allowed my mother to share memories and stories about her sister that she says she had not permitted herself to think about, let alone speak aloud, in over 60 years. My mother has expressed both gratitude that this secret came to light and a kind of grief for the decades during which an entire family maintained a silence that prevented genuine mourning and remembrance of a young woman who deserved better than to be erased from her own family's history because of how she died. I think often about how many families likely carry similar silences from earlier generations, secrets maintained not out of malice but out of a different era's approach to shame and grief, secrets that outlive the original reasons for their concealment and simply persist because no one ever thinks to question why a certain person or story was never discussed. Margaret's existence was erased by an entire family's silence for nearly 70 years. Our final story tonight, Story 4, is about a secret that was not erased through silence. It was erased through active deception, maintained deliberately for over 2 decades by someone who had every opportunity to tell the truth and chose again and again not to. This is the part that gets me the most. Here is what happened. My name is Nicole. I am 36 years old. I live in Sacramento, California, and 13 months ago I discovered, while helping my mother organize old documents after a household move, a folder of legal papers that revealed my parents had actually divorced and remarried each other twice before I was born, a history completely different from the narrative I had grown up believing, which was that they had married once 38 years ago and remained together ever since. My parents' names are David and Carol. I want to describe what I found in that folder, because the documents told a story I had never had any indication of throughout my entire childhood and adult life. The paper showed an initial marriage certificate from 41 years ago, followed by a divorce decree from 39 years ago, followed by a second marriage certificate between the same 2 people from 38 years ago, followed by a second divorce decree from 36 years ago, and finally a third marriage certificate, also between David and Carol, dated 35 years ago. The marriage I had always understood to be their only one. and which had, according to what I had always been told, produced my birth 1 year later. I want to describe what it was like to sit on my parents' garage floor holding evidence of an entire hidden history, 3 marriages and 2 divorces between the same 2 people, none of which I had ever had the slightest indication of throughout 36 years of hearing their relationship described, consistently and specifically, as a single continuous marriage that had simply endured. I confronted my mother immediately, showing her the documents I had found. Her reaction was not shock at being caught but rather a kind of resigned acknowledgement, as though she had known this conversation might eventually happen and had simply hoped it would not. She explained, with my father joining the conversation once he understood what I had discovered, the actual history. They had married young, in their early 20s, and the relationship had been genuinely volatile during that first marriage, ending in divorce after less than 2 years due to what both of them described, without extensive detail, as immaturity and incompatibility issues they had not yet learned to navigate. They had remained in contact after the divorce, eventually reconciling and remarrying 18 months later, only to divorce again after a similarly short period when the same underlying issues resurfaced. Their third marriage, the one I had always known about, had occurred after several years of dating without the pressure of marriage, which they credited with allowing them to finally build the stable, functional relationship that had, in fact, endured for the 35 years since. I want to describe why they had never told me this history. My mother explained that once I was born within their third marriage, they had made a deliberate decision to present their relationship history simply, as a single enduring marriage, believing that the complicated true history, 2 failed marriages followed by a successful third attempt, would be confusing or troubling for a child to understand, and that this simplified narrative had simply become the accepted family story over time, repeated so consistently to me and to extended family members who had married into the family after the fact that it had, in a sense, become true through repetition even though it was not accurate. Update 4 months later. I have spent considerable time processing this revelation, which affected me less because of the specific facts themselves. 2 young people struggling and eventually finding stability is, in some ways, a more relatable and even inspiring story than a simple uninterrupted marriage, and more because of the decades of deliberate narrative construction that had kept this history from me. My parents have been, since the initial confrontation, notably more open about discussing this period of their lives when I ask questions, sharing details about their early volatile relationship and their eventual growth that I have found genuinely valuable in understanding both them as individuals and my own approach to my long-term relationship with my partner. I have also had to process a strange kind of grief about my own understanding of my family history, realizing that extended family gatherings, casual conversations about how my parents met, and even documents like my parents' 35th wedding anniversary celebration 2 years ago, had all been built around a narrative that was not quite accurate, without my ever having any way to know this. My relationship with my parents remains fundamentally strong, though I have told them clearly that I would have preferred knowing the true, more complicated version of their history from an earlier age, rather than discovering it accidentally in a garage at 36, and that I intend to be more transparent with my own future children about the actual complexity of relationships and family history rather than defaulting to simplified narratives, however well-intentioned the reasoning behind. Such simplification might be, David and Carol maintained, a simplified, however well-intentioned the reasoning behind. Such simplification might be, David and Carol maintained, a simplified narrative. For 36 years. Our final story tonight, Story 5, is about a secret that was not maintained. To protect a child from complexity, it was maintained. To protect an inheritance, an entire family fortune, built on a foundation that, once uncovered, changed who actually had a legitimate claim to any of it. This is the last story, and it may be the most consequential one you hear tonight. Here is what happened. My name is Margaret. I am 51 years old. I live in Boston, Massachusetts, and 8 months ago, while researching family history for my aunt's memorial service, I discovered documents in a family storage archive that revealed the manufacturing business that had been the foundation of my family's considerable wealth for 3 generations had originally been co-founded on equal terms by my great-grandfather and a business partner whose contribution and ownership stake had been systematically written out of the company's history through legal maneuvering that occurred roughly 70 years ago. My great-grandfather's name was Charles. He founded what became a successful manufacturing company that, over 3 generations, provided my family with substantial wealth, funding private educations, real estate, and a lifestyle that my extended family had always attributed entirely to Charles's individual business acumen and hard work. What I found in the storage archive were original partnership documents from the company's founding, showing that Charles had actually co-founded the business with a man named Joseph Whitman, each holding equal 50% ownership stakes, along with a series of legal documents from approximately 15 years after the founding showing a complex series of transactions that appear to have systematically diluted and eventually eliminated Joseph's ownership stake entirely, transactions that, based on the specific legal language and timing, appeared designed to take advantage of Joseph during what other documents suggested was a period of significant personal and financial difficulty in his life. I want to describe the process of understanding what these documents actually showed, because it required consultation with a business historian and an attorney familiar with corporate law of that era to fully interpret what had happened. The pattern that emerged was this. Joseph had experienced a period of serious illness roughly 15 years after co-founding the company with Charles, during which he was unable to actively participate in business operations. During this period, Charles had structured a series of capital calls and ownership dilution mechanisms that, while technically legal under the partnership agreement specific language, appeared designed specifically to exploit Joseph's inability to participate or contest these changes during his illness, gradually reducing his ownership stake from 50% down to a negligible fraction before eventually structuring a final buyout of Joseph's remaining minimal stake at a price significantly below what an independent valuation of the time suggested the stake was actually worth. Joseph, according to additional records I found, had died in poverty roughly 10 years after losing his ownership stake, while Charles had gone on to build the company into the substantial enterprise that eventually funded my entire family's multi-generational wealth. I want to describe what it felt like to understand that the foundation of my family's fortune, the wealth that had funded my own education and lifestyle, had been built in significant part through what appeared to be a deliberate exploitation of a business partner's illness and vulnerability. I brought these documents to a family meeting with my parents, my aunt, and my siblings, all of whom were as shocked as I was, having grown up as I had, believing entirely in the narrative of Charles as a self-made success story rather than someone who had, based on what the documents strongly suggested, taken deliberate advantage of a vulnerable partner to consolidate sole ownership of what had originally been an equal partnership. Update. 4 months later, my family engaged a genealogist and attorney to locate Joseph Whitman's living descendants, a process that took several months but ultimately identified 3 living great-grandchildren of Joseph's, none of whom had any significant wealth or knowledge of their ancestors' original business partnership, having grown up on their side of this history, simply knowing that their great-grandfather had died in difficult financial circumstances, without understanding the specific mechanism by which he had lost his original business stake. My family has made the collective decision, still being finalized through legal processes, to establish a substantial trust fund for Joseph's descendants, an amount our family's attorneys and an independent historian helped us calculate based on what a fair reconstruction of Joseph's original 50% stake would likely be worth today, accounting for the company's growth over the subsequent decades, adjusted for the fact that we cannot know with certainty how the company might have developed differently under genuinely equal partnership. This decision has not been unanimous or simple within my family. Some relatives have expressed reluctance about acknowledging fault for actions taken 70 years ago by an ancestor none of us ever knew, while others, myself included, have felt strongly that continuing to benefit from wealth built through what appears to be deliberate exploitation, once we had clear knowledge of this history, would make us complicit in a way that inaction could not resolve. The process of meeting Joseph's descendants, establishing this restitution, and reconciling our family's actual history with the mythology we had always believed about Charles's self-made success has been, without question, one of the most complicated and consequential experiences of my adult life, forcing me to reconsider not just facts about my own family but broader questions about how much of what any of us understand about our family's success stories might contain similarly unexamined foundations.